Hi, everyone. Thanks for checking out our second webinar in this webinar series. In this webinar, we'll be talking about the use of intermittent fasting for weight management in elite athletes. My name is Addie Lears. I'm currently a graduate student at Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota. I did my graduate capstone research on weight management practices in elite athletes. So I'll just be sharing the research that is out there and current for the use of intermittent fasting in athlete populations. That being said, let's get started with our objectives. So, learning objective number one will be able to define intermittent fasting in terms of weight management. Objective two, understand reasons why elite athletes may be interested in using intermittent fasting to assist with weight management. And objective three, be aware of the research that is currently available on the use of intermittent fasting to assist with weight loss and weight maintenance. I'm sure you all have heard of intermittent fasting before, but just to refresh our memory on what it is. So, intermittent fasting, again, is a diet characterized by having scheduled periods for eating and then scheduled periods for fasting. So there's various types of intermittent fasting, ranging from total alternate day fasting, where one alternates between fasting days and feasting days, to what is known as then time restricted feeding, labeled TRF, where daily food intake is consumed in a narrow time window, with the rest of the hours in the day being a fasting period. So it is common to fast for at least 12 hours. However, a common TRF pattern followed is called the 16-8. So this is where one fasts for 16 hours in the day and then feasts for 8 hours. So you'll see in the research studies we look at here in a short bit that all of those studies followed a 16-8 TRF pattern. So, really, the ultimate goal of intermittent fasting and why one does fast for such long periods is to reach what's known as the metabolic switch. So, this is when the body has virtually exhausted all its glucose and liver glycogen stores, and it instead moves to fatty acid oxidation and using fatty acid derived ketones for energy. So, why might elite athletes be interested in using intermittent fasting for weight management? So, it's pretty well known that intermittent fasting is used for weight loss. However, it might not be as well known that there's also been other health benefits, such as improved blood lipids and glycemic control, decreased inflammatory markers, and reduced fat mass that are associated with intermittent fasting dietary strategies. So, all of these could be of interest to athletes, especially, that weight loss and reduced fat mass, trying to improve that body composition. We're first going to look at the research on intermittent fasting for weight loss. So, there is only really one study that was published in 2020 that looks at the effects of a caloric deficit in the form of a 16-8 time restricted feeding. So then that 16 hours fasting, 8 hours feasting. So this study was a randomized controlled study design. And again, it looked at a 16-8 time restricted feeding versus a normal meal distribution in 26 recreationally active males. So this study spanned over the course of 6 weeks. However, the first week and the last week were intervention tests. And then sandwiched between these intervention tests was the actual diet intervention period. Again, participants were assigned to one of two groups, either the TRF group or the normal daily feeding group. So during this study, again, it was a 16-8 time restricted feeding for that intermittent fasting group, and all participants ate 75% of their resting energy expenditure times an activity factor of 1.5. So this put them in a 25% caloric deficit. They had or both groups had a prescribed protein intake of 1.8 grams per kilogram body weight per day. The rest of their calories could be allotted to carbohydrate and fat intake. There was no quantity specified for either group. Those in the TRF group were required to consume all their prescribed calories and macros in an 8-hour time period. And this 8-hour time period was either noon to 8 p.m. or 1 p.m. to 9 p.m., just on their preferred eating window. The normal dietary distribution group was allowed to eat at whatever time they wanted. All participants did track their dietary intake in MyFitnessPal for 3 times a week, just so that their dietary compliance could be measured. During the intervention period, participants did engage in a full body resistance training protocol. This was done 3 times per week. Participants also completed several questionnaires before or after each training session. These questionnaires span from a perceived recovery scale questionnaire, daily analyses of life demands for athletes, and visual scales for energy, desire to eat, hunger, fullness, and motivation to do physical tasks. Participants' body composition was measured via the 4C model, and they also had their muscle morphology, thickness, and quality evaluated via ultrasound. Muscular performance was also measured, and this was measured via a vertical jump test and an estimated 1 repetition maximum for a barbell bench press and leg press. So all statistical analyses were conducted via an independent samples t-test to detect baseline differences between groups, while two-way repeated measures, ANOVA, was conducted to analyze dependent variables. Getting into our results of this study, the first of these was that this study demonstrated that a 16-8 time-restricted feeding pattern with an emphasis on that high protein intake combined with resistance training did not negatively influence participants' ability to maintain fat-free mass nor compromise improvements in muscular strength and power. Another interesting discovery of this study was that perceived recovery and perceived readiness regarding training did not differ between the diet groups, even though the TRF group was fasting for 16 hours at a time. The TRF diet group also did not have any differences in fullness, desire to eat, hunger, feelings of energy, or motivation to perform physical tasks when compared to the normal diet distribution group. That being said, although this study's findings did not demonstrate that a 16-8 time restricted feeding had negative impacts on participants' body composition and muscular performance, researchers did conclude that a short-term TRF did not elicit more favorable alterations in body composition when compared to a normal meal distribution. So this is an important consideration to think about, especially with athletes' busy schedules. Only having 8 hours in a day to eat might not be feasible for some athletes, nor would maybe they have the same responses for that desire or fullness and feelings of energy after 16 hours of fasting than this study demonstrated. The study also had some limitations that should be reported. So participants did self-report their dietary intake only for 12 days throughout this entire 4-week intervention period. So it might not have been truthful or actually have been representative of what they were eating throughout the entire 4 weeks. It also was a relatively short intervention period, only being for 4 weeks. It would be preferred that intervention periods would last 8 to 24 weeks. This way we'd have a little bit more of an idea of the long-term effects of following a TRF dietary strategy. So putting it all together, again, very little research on a hypocaloric intermittent fasting dietary strategy on athletes' body composition and performance. We just have that one study to go off of. And we know that with fasting comes decreased muscle protein synthesis. And when you pair that with energy restriction, you're getting even more decreased muscle protein synthesis, which is of concern, especially with that lean body mass retention. So, again, although the findings of Stratton and colleagues demonstrated that a 16-8 time restricted feeding at that 25% calorie deficit did not negatively impact body composition, it didn't elicit any more favorable alterations compared to a normal meal distribution. So, now switching our attention to weight maintenance, we're going to be looking at two studies that have been published in the last 10 years. The first one we're going to look at was published by Morrow and colleagues in 2014. So, this study sought to discover if an isoenergenic time restricted feeding protocol in combination with resistance training had any effects on body composition, athletic performance, and metabolic factors in 34 healthy resistance trained men. So, this study contained an 8-week experimental period where subjects were randomly assigned to either the TRF group, again, following that 16-8 pattern, or the standard diet group. In both groups, participants consumed 100% of their daily energy needs. This was figured out by gas analysis system, and their intake was measured via a 7-day food diary that was analyzed by nutritional software. The TRF group consumed their daily calories over the course of 3 meals at 1 p.m., 4 p.m., and 8 p.m., whereas the normal diet distribution group followed what would be a normal meal distribution. So breakfast at 8 a.m., lunch at 1 p.m., and then dinner at 8 p.m. Both groups were not prescribed specific macronutrient distributions. However, I have posted up here what the TRF group had for their average daily macronutrient distribution. So that was about 25% of their total calorie intake, protein at 23.8%, which put them at 1.93 grams per kilogram body weight per day, and then carbohydrates being 51.2%. All participants were required to participate in a resistance training program. This consisted of 3 weekly training sessions performed on non-consecutive days. Body measurements were assessed via DEXA and skin folds on participants' biceps, triceps, and thighs. And then strength was measured via 1 repetition maximum for bench press and leg press. Blood samples were also collected on these test days. Baseline differences between groups were tested via an independent samples t-test, and then differences between groups over the course of the study were measured via 2-way repeated measures ANOVA. So, results of Morrow and colleagues' study found that there was a significant decrease in fat mass in the TRF group after 8 weeks, while fat-free mass was maintained in both groups. At the end of the study, inflammation markers were lower in the TRF group when compared to the normal diet distribution group. However, the TRF group did experience reduced levels of testosterone and insulin like growth factor 1. That being said, the authors of this study did conclude that a 16-8 time restricted feeding pattern can be beneficial in athletes who are looking to maintain their muscle mass while reducing fat mass during the maintenance phases of training. Do want to point out on one limitation of this study was that it did rely on interviews between subjects and dietitians only once a week to make sure that subjects were adhering to their diet protocol, as intake was only actually tracked for 7 days out of the entire 8-week period. So there could have been differences in energy and nutrient intakes between the groups, which ultimately could have affected their observed outcomes. Also, this study was just looking at a single population, those being resistance trained males. So the results of this study, needed to be reproduced in a more diverse population to have a better understanding of the effects of a TRF dietary pattern on athlete populations. So the next study we're going to look at, answered this call though. They looked at time restricted feeding in resistance trained females, a population that hadn't been looked at prior to this study for an isoenergetic time restricted feeding. Tinsley and colleagues looked at the effects of a TRF diet pattern with or without supplementation of the leucine metabolite beta methyl butyrate, labeled as HMB, during fasting periods compared to a control diet, which again was just that normal diet distribution. Researchers specifically wanted to see if fat mass, fat-free mass, skeletal muscle hypertrophy, muscular strength, and other physiological variables like glucose, insulin, blood lipids, and cortisol levels would change in response to resistance training with the different diets. So, this study was a randomized, placebo controlled, double blind, reduced factorial design, and it looked at 40 participants. These 40 participants were assigned to one of three study groups. So, either the control diet plus placebo, the TRF plus placebo, or the TRF plus HMB. Subjects in the TRF, placebo, and the TRF HMB groups were directed to consume all of their daily calories between 12 p.m. to 8 p.m. each day, while the controlled diet subjects were able to eat at self-selected times all day. Daily energy intake was calculated as participants' REE, which was measured via indirect telemetry, times an activity factor of 1.5. I do want to mention that this was then subtracted from 250 calories to induce a slight caloric reduction just to promote that fat loss. Participants were instructed to have a protein intake of equal to or greater than 1.4 grams per kilogram body weight per day. This was for all diet groups. In addition, the TRF plus HMB group consumed 3 1-gram doses of HMB per day, equating to 3 grams total per day. In combination with the dietary program, participants of all three groups completed an 8-week resistance training program 3 days a week. And then during weeks 0, 4, and 8, participants completed several training or testing sessions in the morning. So they have their body composition assessed using the 4C model. They had their resting metabolic rate and substrate utilization measured via indirect telemetry. They also had blood and saliva samples measured. Then in the afternoon of these testing days, participants completed their muscular performance assessment. This assessment just consisted of a counter movement jump, a vertical jump, a mechanized squat device, and then a 1 repetition maximum and repetitions until failure of the bench press and hip sled exercise. Participants also completed lifestyle questionnaires during morning laboratory assessments. So all these data analyses were conducted using a 1-factor or repeated measures ANOVA. From their data, Tinsley and colleagues found that resistance-trained females following the 16-8 TRF program did not have impairments in fat-free muscle gains, skeletal muscle hypertrophy, or muscular performance compared to the control diet. Researchers also did not find that following a time-restricted feeding dietary pattern impacted the physiological variables of resting metabolic rate, substrate utilization, blood lipids, glucose, insulin, blood pressure, or cortisol levels. However, leucine supplementation did not have any distinct benefits in this study. So although leucine is known for its ability to stimulate muscle protein synthesis, again, this study didn't find that it had any benefits. Want to point out several limitations of this study. So this study did employ a self-reported dietary intake strategies for all participants. So nutrient intakes that researchers estimated need to be interpreted with some caution. However, this study did have several strengths that I want to point out. So it did have that rigorous body composition assessment methodology of using the 4C model, and also the strong study design using that double-blind design concerning the HMB and placebo supplements. This study also was the first of its kind to look at the effects of intermittent in active female adults, a population that hadn't been studied regarding intermittent fasting before. So, taking both these studies' results, it does appear that a 16-8 time restricted dietary pattern does not have adverse effects on body composition and performance in resistance trained males and females. So, intermittent fasting may be helpful for athletes focusing on weight maintenance to improve fat free mass and even decrease fat mass. However, both studies were conducted over an 8-week time period, so more research is needed to determine the longer term effects of intermittent fasting in athletes. Also, just want to point out again, higher protein intakes are needed for intermittent fasting just because of fasting's impact on that muscle protein synthesis. So, from the research that is available, it looks like approximately somewhere between 1.4 to 2 grams per kilogram body weight per day is recommended. So, putting it all together, then, what we've gone through in this webinar, an intermittent fasting dietary strategy, such as that 16 hours fasting, 8 hours feeding, may be useful for athletes wanting to lose fat mass without compromising muscular strength or performance. For athletes choosing to follow intermittent fasting, protein intake needs to be higher to offset that muscle protein breakdown. So we want to stimulate that muscle protein synthesis as much as we can. Fasting inhibits that. So that higher protein intake is just one way to combat that. And then again, I just want to say research is still, minimal on intermittent fasting in athletes. So athletes and their weight management plan should proceed with caution if wanting to start intermittent fasting, especially just because that fasting can affect the fat-free mass. As always, if you have any questions, please contact me at my email, addison.lears99@gmail.com. Here is my reference page if you want to do some more digging on intermittent fasting. And then I have my webinar assessment tool here. So press pause when you are ready. You can start writing or typing down your answers to these 4 questions. Once you're ready, then press play and it will take you to the end of this webinar, which will be the webinar assessment tool answer key. Thanks for watching. Have a great rest of your day. And don't forget to check out the next webinar in this webinar series, which is on the Mediterranean diet. Have a great rest of your day.